Okay.
All right.
She said she may not play the role of the second.
Okay, I have to go back.
All right.
Good luck.
All right, everyone. Those of you who enjoyed the break, coffee, teas, other beverages, the goodies that were on the table, welcome back. It's my pleasure now to introduce Laveza Khan. And she's with ACGC, and Heather recognized her great contribution to Shaping Together 2018. And she's the member Outreach and Government Relations Coordinator at ACGC, and she's responsible for supporting and advocating for CSOs in Alberta that are working locally and globally to achieve sustainable human development. Her work allows her to engage civil society, private sector, and multiple levels of government to work together collectively to advance the SDGs, both in Alberta, Canada, and of course around the world. Earlier this year, Laveza was selected for the Women Deliver Young Leaders Program, which is a unique privilege. So let's give her a big hand of applause. Come on over here before you take the mic. That's a huge privilege. Huge privilege. Alberta grown. And of course, she's committed to advancing gender equality and women's rights both locally and globally. So Laveza, take us forward in terms of what we're doing next.
Thank you everyone for being here today. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to welcome the youth from Inner City High School, Jasper Place High School, McNelly High School, and St. Francis High School all the way from Calgary. Thank you for being here. The conversation on gender equality is crucial to accelerating sustainable development, and one which is central to Together 2018. I'm honored to welcome and introduce our keynote speaker, Shiza Shahid. Shiza is an entrepreneur, investor, and thought leader. She's passionate about leveraging philanthropy, entrepreneurship, technology, and the media to drive scalable social impact. Shiza co-founded the Malala Fund with Malala Yousafzai and led the organization as founding CEO through to the Nobel Peace Prize. She's now focused on supporting mission-driven startups whose financial successes make the world a better place through her fund and platform, Now Ventures. Shiza is a prominent speaker on social innovation and impact, human rights, women's rights, and mission-driven business. Shiza speaks frequently at major international convenings, including Aspen Ideas Fest, Milk and Global Institute, Forbes Women, Fortune Most Powerful Women, Women Moving Millions, World Economic Forum. Shiza was also the host of the social justice TV show Aspirist, which aired on USA Network and CNN HLN. Shiza grew up in Pakistan as a vocal advocate for social change. She graduated from Stanford University with distinction. She was a business analyst with McKinsey & Company. She also graduated from Singularity University, where she studied how to apply technology towards the goal of solving gender inequities. Please welcome Shiza Shahid.
Thank you, Laveza, for that lovely bio. The wonderful thing of being introduced by an incredible Pakistani woman, you get to feel very proud of women from your part of the world, but also they pronounce your name right, which rarely happens to me. So I'm coming straight from Paris, where I spent the past week eating croissants for breakfast, chocolate for lunch, and cheese for dinner. And you'll have to forgive me if I'm in a little bit of a jet lag and food coma. But in all seriousness, I am honored to be here, kicking off a conversation that I believe is one of the most important projects of our lifetime, the Sustainable Development Goals, and how we achieve this global consensus on human development. And Canada and Alberta have been leaders in this, and I'm grateful to the Alberta Council for Global Cooperation for this convening and for this opportunity. But this is a very large conversation, and I'm gonna have to choose a couple of parts of it where I have personally focused. So I'm gonna share with you how I've approached the Sustainable Development Goals and my piece of making an impact. And I'll also share my story, because I believe it is only by sharing our stories openly and with vulnerability, that we can break down the barriers that exist between us and collaborate to create a better world. So my story begins in an unlikely place, and it begins with the story of my parents. That's a photograph of them behind me. Let me tell you a little bit about their story. So my father was born in a village in Pakistan. He lost his own father when he was 9 years old and grew up quite poor after that. My mother was born in a neighboring city. She was the oldest of 4 sisters, born into a very traditional family, and told from a young age that she would not get to pursue higher education or build a career, that her only real possibilities in life were to be a wife and a mother. She was married to my father when she was 19 years old, met him on their wedding day, looked around and asked which one he was. But fortunately, they turned out to be a pretty incredible couple, supporting and empowering each other, and they made the radical decision that no matter the cost, their children would have a better life. So I was fortunate. I got to grow up in a humble but loving home in the capital of Pakistan, Islamabad, and I had a relatively good education. But I was also growing up in a country that has the second highest number of children out of school in the entire world, in a country that's ranked the second worst place to be born a woman. And at the time that I was growing up, things were getting worse. There was rising violence, terrorism, religious extremism. And I wanted to make sense of that. I wanted to understand what was happening to my society. So I did the only thing I could think of as a 13-year-old. I began showing up at the doors of nonprofits and asking them to let me volunteer. And that led to some of the most transformative years of my life. I worked in women's prisons where a local nonprofit would set up medical camps. There were no female doctors for the women prisoners, so in Pakistan's conservative culture, many of the women would not come forward when they were ill. What surprised me most about my time in the prisons was how many little children were also there inside the jails, because they had been born to their mothers inside prison and had never left, because there was no one outside for them. And it was there in those interactions that I first came to understand what it means to be discarded before you're even born, and to be truly trapped in a cycle of poverty. When I was 14, I worked to write case studies of women who had been given microloans and microenterprise training. And I was constantly struck by the power of women to lift themselves out of poverty if given the opportunity to be entrepreneurial. I remember one woman in particular whom we gave a loan to along with some business training. She used that to start a corner shop, to lift her family out of debt and send her 3 daughters to school. She didn't just uplift her own possibilities, but those of her entire family and her community. And this was something that we saw over and over again, and something that the data supported. When you empowered a woman to earn $1, she invested 90% back into her family and her community. It was typically 30 to 40% for men. So if there's a silver bullet in fighting poverty, it's economically empowering women. But there were also significant challenges to empowering women, particularly amongst the more conservative communities in the country. I was confronted with these attitudes after Pakistan suffered a massive earthquake. At the time, I was 16 years old, and I began volunteering with communities who had been affected by the earthquake. They had come down to Islamabad, the capital, and were living in makeshift refugee housing. And many of them came from the north of the country, a part that I hadn't spent much time in. I was spending one day in particular with young girls and children who I used to spend most of my time with in the camp. And I remember we were sitting inside their tents where they were living and talking about music and movies. And I said, let's go outside for a walk. It's so claustrophobic in here. And I remember them turning to me and saying, well, we're not allowed to go outside for a walk during the day because our families don't want us to be seen by the other men. It was in these conversations, in these communities, that my own understanding of the world was challenged and cut open. How could a woman have so much power that with a loan and some business training, she could lift her community out of poverty, yet such little power that she couldn't go outside for a walk during the day? How could some people be filled with the greatest love and generosity in the name of religion, and others commit the most hateful acts of violence and terrorism in the name of that same religion? I think as we go about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, it's important to embrace the nuance, to embrace the complexity that exists within communities, and to suspend judgment, bias, and prejudice. And most of all, to work with local leaders, because everything that I achieved, everything that I did that was actually effective, was when I empowered someone else who actually embodied the complexities and nuances of that culture to lead from within. Now, when I was 17, I began applying to colleges. I fully expected to go to a local school, but I decided to try my luck. I was naive enough to Google top 10 schools in the United States, since I'd heard in America they gave scholarships. And I applied to them all, not knowing how hard it would be. I was fortunate. I got a full scholarship to Stanford University, so I moved from Pakistan to Silicon Valley when I was 17 years old, and my perspective on the world shifted. Here I was surrounded by technology companies that were changing the way we lived. All of my classmates wanted to be entrepreneurs, but very few of them had actually worked in communities in Pakistan or in places outside of Silicon Valley, and most of them were solving challenges for their own friends, building apps that delivered your pizza or delivered your laundry or helped you find a girlfriend. As one investor described it, building apps to take care of all of the challenges your mother used to take care of. And so I thought that perhaps I could apply the tools of technology and entrepreneurship to my own work, but also that perhaps I had something to offer this world of technology and entrepreneurship. But at the same time that I was becoming more curious about the link between tech entrepreneurship and social change, things back home were getting worse. There were terrorist attacks very close to my home, and I became more fearful for my family. But there was one issue in particular that I was most perturbed by. There's a town in the north of Pakistan called the Swat Valley. It's somewhat remote compared to the capital city and the large cities of Pakistan. It used to be a beautiful place known as the Switzerland of Pakistan, but it had been taken over by a terrorist group linked to the Taliban. This group became increasingly violent, began to blow up girls' schools, and in January 2009 declared an all-out ban on female education. I remember sitting in my dorm room thinking, here I am getting this incredible education, and 300 miles from where I grew up, girls are being told they can't go to school. But most people weren't aware this was happening. When I spoke to most of my classmates, they didn't know where the Swat Valley was, let alone that girls' education was being banned there. And I thought, maybe there was a way to get this story to be heard around the world. So I began doing some research, and I came across a diary. It was a diary by a little girl, and she was writing about her experiences as a schoolgirl in the Swat Valley. And she wrote, "This is my plea to the world. Save my school, save my Swat Valley." I remember reading that diary thinking, this is like the diary of Anne Frank. This girl is writing about her experiences in a time of extreme violence, but we can actually still help her. And so I decided I would create a secret summer camp. And I would bring out this schoolgirl and others like her from her community who wanted to share their stories, who wanted to bring change in their hometown. I'm going to play a video now. It's about a decade old, but it tells you a little bit about the summer camp and the work that we did there. And turn the volume up? Thanks. Just some technical difficulties.
The Taliban had intimidated. It's a war that separates extremists from more moderate forces, clashing in the most beautiful part of Pakistan, the Swat Valley. The Taliban had intimidated the population, including young girls, forbidding them from going to school. These 26 girls are living witnesses to the central battle within Islam today. They're in Islamabad, part of a program that takes them out of their homes in the Swat Valley. Helping them, a group of university students of Pakistani background who've returned home from abroad with a simple goal: teach the children the importance of education. Shiza chose to spend her summer here, between the 3rd and 4th years of her studies at Stanford University in California.
Pretending to be younger students so that they could go to school, not wearing their uniforms so that they could go to school, hiding their books under their shawls so that they could go to school. And at that point, I think we were just so angry and upset and emotional that we decided we had to do something.
The idea is simple enough: confidence-building measures, critical thinking lessons, all framed in the context of religious values the children have heard before, but this time from a different point of view. It's still dangerous. The girls cannot talk about Taliban harassment because while the government is confident the Taliban was flushed out of the region, the ideology of Sharia law may still linger, and these girls will have to return to their homes in the Swat Valley. So, we talk about childhood dreams.
So I want to become president and to rule this country in a good way.
So you want to become president to prove to people that a woman can become president of Pakistan?
Yeah.
And you decided this, how old again are you?
12.
I don't think I believe you.
Okay, I'm just
I think maybe
35.
like 30.
They're young, idealistic, but have seen enough to make them grow up quickly. Cal Perry, CNN, Islamabad.
So I wanted to share that video, even though it's embarrassing, for a couple of reasons. One is the journalist says we cannot talk about the Taliban, so we talk about childhood dreams. And the reason he says that is because the condition upon which he got access to a little bit of the summer camp was that he wouldn't have any of the girls talk against the Taliban on camera, because I knew that if they did that, they would be at risk. And while they were with me, I wanted to protect them. And several years later, it was a decision I was very glad I had made. The other reason is the little girl who says she wants to be president. Did any of you recognize her? So that's Malala when she's 12 years old. Also the same little girl who'd been writing that diary that had first inspired me to create the summer camp. And this, of course, was several years later before she became known on the world stage. Now, I like to share this story because it reminds me of the power that we have to create change in ways that we can often not imagine in the moment. Because I knew right after the summer camp that the work we had done had been effective. For a number of reasons, the government of Pakistan did intervene in the Swat Valley. These girls got to go back to school, and the lessons that they had learned would stay with them as they built their lives as schoolgirls and as activists. But what I could never have imagined back then is that the little girl who had inspired me to create this summer camp in the first place would go on 6 years later to become the youngest ever Nobel Peace Prize winner and one of the most powerful voices for change in the entire world. So we must never doubt our ability to achieve anything, overcome anything, become anything, and inspire everything. It was Margaret Mead who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." That's my favorite photograph of Malala from the summer camp, by the way. So after that camp, I went back to Stanford. I continued to work in Pakistan in the summers and winters, and when I graduated, I took my first job out of college at McKinsey & Company. At the time, it was the top business consulting firm in the world, a dream job for most Stanford graduates, and I was excited. I wanted to learn from the business world, maybe get a business school degree, and then build a mission-driven business or fund. I had my 5-year plan all sorted out, but I was just a year into that plan when I got a text message that made my heart stop. The text message said, "Malala has been shot." I was devastated. I had known her then for several years and was close to her family and immediately flew in to be with them. But I wasn't the only one who cared. The story hit breaking news, and people around the world were outraged that in the 21st century, a girl could be shot in the head simply for wanting to go to school. So I started getting letters and emails from people all over the world who wanted to know more about this girl and whether there was anything they could do to help her. We know today, of course, that Malala did make a full recovery. It is the greatest miracle that I have ever witnessed and something that I'm very grateful for, as are many people around the world. Once she was feeling better, I went to her and her family and said, "There's a lot of people who want to help you. What should I tell them to do?" And I remember that she turned back to me and said, I'm really okay. You should tell them to help the other girls. It was in that conversation and the conversations that followed that I realized that what Malala had been through could be far more than a day in the news cycle. Another story of a victim that shocked us but was forgotten without any real change. But I had a decision to make in that moment. Would I go back to my career, to my 5-year plan, or would I take a leap of faith and put everything on the line and stay with Malala and try to help share her story and create change in the world? I want you to picture being 22, a year out of college, with no savings, and deciding to build a career as a 22-year-old with a 15-year-old, trying to get the world to invest in your ideas. At the moment, it was terrifying, and I share this because I know there's a lot of students in the audience. But Malala and her family urged me to stay, and my heart had a clear answer. So at 22, I quit my job and spent the next 2.5 years helping Malala's story be heard around the world. And through that, the story of the 130 million girls around the world that are denied an education, and building what is now a global organization, the Malala Fund. I believe that there are certain moments in our lives when we have to decide who we are. This is true in our values, in our relationships, in our careers. In those moments, all we can hope for is to be guided by our hopes and not by our fears. Everyone's story is different, but we only get one on this earth. So as Mary Oliver said, tell me, what is it that you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? So I spent 2.5 years with Malala and her family building the Malala Fund, and we advocated for policy changes that would help girls around the world access 12 years of free, high-quality education. And that's why I believe the Sustainable Development Goals are so important. But we also spent a lot of time in the grassroots, putting a media spotlight on the issues that we believe needed to be heard. This is a photograph from northern Nigeria, where we went after almost 300 schoolgirls were kidnapped by the terrorist group Boko Haram. You see parents of the missing children, one of the mothers holding up a photograph of her daughter, trying to get the world to believe her daughter's missing so that they would help her. And this is a photograph from Jordan, where we're sitting with Syrian refugee girls. Today, we have the greatest refugee crisis since World War II, and on average, refugees are displaced for 17 years. We simply don't have an adequate response to refugee education. In the photograph, you see young refugee girls with candles, and when we asked them to pray for what they wanted, they each prayed that they could just go home, live in peace, and get an education. And this is a photograph from the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. You see Malala at the back with Kailash Satyarthi, the Indian gentleman with whom she shared the Nobel Peace Prize that year, and he, of course, has spent his life fighting child slavery. So it really was a peace prize that focused on the rights of children. And as I watched Malala go on that pulpit that Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa had spoken from, 17 years old, all of 5'2" with her headscarf, I knew that we had shattered stereotypes about what courage looks like and what girls can achieve if they are just given an education. And for me, I knew that it was time to invest in other bold leaders, other change makers with a big vision, a big idea to change the world, other Malalas. So, to do that, I launched an investment fund called Now Ventures. And with that, I now invest in mission-driven entrepreneurs, startup leaders with an idea that can improve the world at scale. And as part of that, I make an extra effort to invest in women and people of color who have traditionally been excluded from the startup ecosystem. So I want to talk about why this is the path that I've chosen and why I think technology, business, and leaders, including women and people of color who have traditionally been excluded, are so central to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's 3 things here that I want to focus on. The first is the evolving role of business. So we know that trillions are traded in the financial markets every day, and nonprofits are a fraction of that, unfortunately. And for that reason, we need to evolve the role of business. This old idea that businesses exist only to maximize profits can no longer sustain in a world where we are growing closer and closer to a climate catastrophe. The good news is that research increasingly proves that those businesses that have a mission and have an authentic mission that goes beyond corporate social responsibility, something that is truly integrated into their business model, into their supply chain, and is authentic, those businesses actually perform better financially. And there's a couple of reasons for this. And there's a couple of reasons why this is true today and will be even more true in the future, particularly the values, preferences, and beliefs of the millennial generation. So millennials are the largest workforce in human history, and while we have many faults, we are increasingly guided by our values and by our desire to make a difference in the world. And this is even more true of Gen Z than it is of millennials. I think it's a growing trend. 94% of millennial consumers say that they would switch brands to one that supports a cause. 9 out of 10 have ruled out working for a company because of its values or standard of conduct. Millennials are also notoriously the flakiest generation, but they are twice as likely to stay in a job and 3 times more energized if they feel like they're contributing to something. And in a time when talent is the greatest contributor to business success, I believe businesses can't afford to ignore the importance of becoming more mission-driven. So what does this mean? I'll share one example of what not to do and then one example of what to do. KFC, a couple of years ago, tried to be more mission-driven, and so they did this program where if you bought a bucket of fried chicken, they would donate to cancer research. And then they tested that fried chicken and found chemicals that caused cancer in that fried chicken. So it backfired, and I think it's kind of an example of the inauthentic ways in which many businesses are trying to appear mission-driven without really spending the time to look at their business models, their hiring practices, their culture, their inclusion, their practices around diversity. But I'll share an example of something that I think does work. So my mantra is link your impact to your business model, to your most expensive services. And I gave this talk to a group of small to mid-sized business owners several years ago. And one of them stood up and said, well, my company repairs jet engines. How do I link my impact to that? And we talked about it, and he came back the next year, and he said, well, we figured it out. We now repair the jet engines on the Doctors Without Borders planes. So I believe any business that truly cares about mission can become more mission-driven, and that's a big part of what I'm trying to do now with Now Ventures. But the other part of this is technology, because we live in a moment in time when technology is transforming our possibilities. So a girl born in Pakistan today with a smartphone and access to the internet has more information than a US president did a decade ago. That allows us to reimagine how we solve the world's most pressing challenges. But it also exposes us to risks and threats that are entirely unforeseen. So I'll give you one example. One revolutionary technology is gene sequencing and gene editing. In 2010, it cost $2.7 billion to sequence the first human DNA. Today, it costs $1,000. By the end of the decade, it will cost $100. Imagine that, from $2.7 billion to $100 in less than a decade. And now we can precisely and cheaply edit that DNA using CRISPR technology. So that allows us to reduce human suffering, perhaps diseases like Huntington's disease and cystic fibrosis. But it also opens the door to all kinds of risks and inequalities, perhaps to market-based eugenics, where wealthy families are able to create designer babies. And I think it is precisely for that reason that it's important that these conversations that are now deciding the fate of humanity forevermore, that these conversations are being led by a group of people that represent the global population. And unfortunately, today that's not the case. Most of these conversations and most of these projects are being led by people from wealthy societies and mostly by white men. And I think it's important for everyone to feel like they have a voice and are included in these conversations. And then the third trend is gender inclusion and the inclusion of people from all backgrounds. So we have good news on this. We're going to talk more about this in the panel that follows. The good news is we are on track to achieve gender equality. The bad news is at our current pace, it will take 217 years. So NASA estimates we will be on Mars much earlier than that. And the World Economic Forum says that gender equality is in retreat today since it began measuring gender equality in 2006. In my sector, technology and investing, we have some of the worst statistics. 2% of technology capital today goes to women, 0.2% to Black women. And this is significant because 76% of young people today say they want to be entrepreneurs. Being an entrepreneur is, I think, what being a celebrity used to be. But when they think of an entrepreneur, they think of Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs. Where are the women? And if you can't see it, you can't be it. And so for me, investing in women and people of color has been really important. But I think the other part of this is if companies are not investing in diverse leadership today, this is more of a problem than it's ever been before. And I'll explain why. So we all heard about the riots in Myanmar, which led to thousands of Rohingya Muslims being killed and raped. That started because of a lack of diversity at Facebook. It started because of a video on Facebook, and that was a fake video, and it was a video that incited violence, but because nobody at Facebook understood the local context, and very few people there spoke Burmese, it was a video that wasn't flagged, and it was a video that wasn't removed until it was too late. And so I think that we are now entering an era where diversity is not just good for business. If you're building a global organization, if you don't have diverse perspectives, you can end up causing a lot of harm and violence. And as someone in the tech sector, I think it's really important to mention that and to be cautious against the tech utopianism that we can sometimes fall subject to. Okay, I'm going to start to wrap up because I want to spend the rest of the time with the inspiring panel that we have. But I'll share briefly just 3 examples of companies that I've personally had the privilege of investing in. Clio is a startup that was my first investment, and Clio is creating a new kind of benefits program for working parents because today women are still experiencing the wage gap primarily because of the result of having children, and women are still dropping out of the workforce primarily after they have children. In the US, 40% of women drop out of the workforce after they have their first child. And so Clio has been working with leading tech companies that want to retain female talent to build benefits programs that incorporate the needs of working parents. And Parsley, another female-founded company, which is bringing together the best of Western medicine with functional medicine and is trying to make that accessible. And lastly, Quilt. Quilt is a technology platform that helps women assemble. It helps women come together to co-work, to learn, to network, because today women are left out of the networks that allow them to succeed, and that's one of the primary reasons that prevents women from advancing. So I'll conclude with this. The Sustainable Development Goals are large and they feel grand, and sometimes it can feel like they are too big for us to make a difference. But achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is about the sum of our individual actions. And sometimes those actions become catalytic in ways that we cannot foresee. It's the idea of the butterfly effect, that something as gentle as a butterfly's wings fluttering can cause a typhoon halfway across the world. Or, in the words of my favorite poet, Rumi, you are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. Thank you very much. And I'll now invite my inspiring panelists to join me on stage. I have one, so you guys can share.
We almost got it sorted out, folks.
So now that I've spent the last half an hour talking, I'm going to talk very little, and I have the privilege of sharing the stage with 3 individuals who personally and through their organizations are advancing gender equality. And I'm going to ask them to start by introducing themselves, their own path to this work, and what they're currently focused on. Yeah.
Hi there, my name is Heather Barnaby, and I am the CEO of Girls 20. Girls 20 is an organization that aims to create the next generation of female leaders, and we do that through advocacy, global experiences, and training. A little bit more simply put, we have programs where we identify young women, and we coach, we mentor them, and we bring them to really interesting spaces because we started as an organization based from the G20. So when we think of the G20, we think of a picture of 20 men and usually Angela Merkel. We wanted to change that. We wanted everybody to be thinking about the G20 and to think about where young women's voices could be centered. And so each year we do a global summit in advance of the G20 where we bring young women who have already demonstrated their commitment to their communities and leadership within their communities. And then we train them and we mentor them, and they develop a communique that demands the G20 leaders essentially see and understand what young women need within their communities. So they put together a list of recommendations that we share with them. My path into this, well, we were talking about it a little bit earlier. Frankly, I always grew up volunteering and really believed in the work that focused on women and girls. And I was really fortunate to, once I finished school, I ended up actually getting a job with the Winter Olympics in Vancouver, where I'm from. And as cool as that was, and as cool as it was to be at the gold medal hockey game, because I was there, it actually made me see what it looked like when people were truly passionate about what they did, and I wasn't truly passionate about the Olympics. So I actually went backpacking around South America, and when I was there, I saw a number of awesome organizations doing really important work with women who particularly were in the Andes area. After that, I decided that I would be focusing on women and girls as I moved forward, and was able to work for Care Canada, an excellent organization that does a lot of sexual and reproductive health, women's economic empowerment work, and then with Right to Play, where I did girls' education projects across the Middle East, Africa, different parts of Asia, and South America.
Thank you. So I'm Julie Savard-Shaw. I'm the Director of Partnership for the Women Deliver Mobilization. The mobilization is housed at CanWatch, the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health. I've been there for almost 7 months. I was previously at the Prime Minister's office, advising him on policies around international development, gender issues, and immigration policies. My path to where I am today, I've always been passionate about international development, particularly women and girls' rights. I remember, and what really changed my life was doing this type of 1990s development style project where my high school brought me to a small community, and we opened a community center that was never to be used again. But I kept in touch with the families there, and throughout the years, talking about what they needed and what they wanted, and ended up with a close friend of mine who's now deceased, opening a music school in the community. And what that did, and it's very small, but what that did was it allowed me to go back and forth often and to learn even more about working on the ground and how you can empower local actors. And then kind of pursued my academic career from there. Worked at Results Canada as well as Nobel Women's Initiative. I also lived in India for almost 2 years, where I worked in microfinance institutions with women on the ground. And then made the leap to the political side of things, where I felt that there was a way to have even more impact, and worked on that. And finally came to the realization, and I'll go about that afterwards, but that the government can't actually do this alone, and it's really time for us as Canadians to step up. And so I felt that I had an opportunity here to apply my skills and to bring Canadians along in the lead up to Women Deliver.
Hi there, my name's Mac Capobianco, and I'm the Director of Business Development with the Rumi Initiative, and I want to thank you very much for teeing that up beautifully for me. So Rumi is a nonprofit tech organization that provides access to digital resources for communities around the world that have little or no connectivity. In my life, I guess the way that I got here, a bit similar to what you were mentioning before, maybe not a traditional path, but as an individual, I had been given a lot, through family and through friends in life, and always knew that I wanted to give back, but I never really knew how that was going to manifest itself. In university, I met a professor that really had a true impact on my life and kind of focused my lens to the international scene and to what was happening around the globe and the inequities that were there. And as a result of that, I changed kind of my career path and moved into eventually the humanitarian space. And I've been in nonprofits for about 13 years. So I was fortunate enough to work in 35 countries around the world running international humanitarian operations, and through that really saw what the true value of education is. Because, on day one of a disaster, for example, day 2, week 1, week 5, whatever it is, when you're providing people with life-sustaining needs, medical attention, clean drinking water, food, it's wonderful, and it really does sustain life in the immediate aftermath. But it's a long-term, recursive tendencies that are really the true problems, right? It's the ones where if I'm a family and I have to pull my kids out of school because they need to work to help recover after this disaster, the reality is that they're not going to go back, and that's another generation that's lost.
So these are 3 really incredible leaders running highly influential organizations, and I can say that as someone in this space because I've known and admired their work from afar. But what's really interesting is how non-traditional their paths have been, and I wanted to point that out for the students in the audience because I believe that this idea of a traditional career path is really changing, and sometimes this advice of follow your passion can be really overwhelming because it's like, well, I don't know what my passion is. And I say, well, follow your curiosities, follow your interests, and be aware of what are the things that are grabbing your attention, that are keeping you up at night, and follow that. And I don't think you will have a straight path, but it will lead you into the type of work that they're doing today, where you will be fulfilled and you will be able to make a difference while working for an inspiring, fast-paced organization or starting your own. But I know that also a big theme of this conference is cross-sector partnerships. So have the 3 of you experienced or been part of cross-sector partnerships that have been effective or not? And what advice do you have around those?
Thank you. So I think, and a number of panelists this morning have addressed this, but I think if we want to be truly effective, we need to stop working in silos. We can no longer have the financial sector here, the health sector here, the education sector here. Women and gender diverse people have a full life. We need to look at them, put them at the center and look at their full life cycle approach. In order to truly achieve gender equality or make gender equality a reality, we need to work across all these areas of a women and gender diverse people's life. And to do that, we need to work across sectors. And the other thing I'd say is that cross-sectoral partnerships can be a little intimidating for people in the development sector, but we need to just put ourselves out there and step outside our comfort zone and bring new people in. Since launching the mobilization, I've tried to meet with non-traditional actors, and I'm reaching out to the farmers, the credit unions, and I'm not gonna lie, every time I'm about to go into a meeting, I have a little moment of panic. And I think one piece is the imposter syndrome, which is another conversation, but totally related to gender norms. But the other piece is, I'm fearful that they're probably thinking, why does she want to talk to me? Like, what does credit unions have to do with gender equality and what she's doing? But actually, the majority of the time, they're super thankful because they want to be part of that conversation, and no one's ever reached out to them. They've never been asked to collaborate, and they've never been asked to participate. So I would encourage everyone to really go talk to new people. the way I gauge whether our mobilization events are successful is if I recognize no one in the room. And if I recognize no one in the room, then I know it's been a really successful event because we've brought new people in, and they will then go out in their own communities with their own friends and with their own families and talk about those important issues. So that's what we're trying to do with the mobilization.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I just want to echo one of the sentiments in there, which is breaking out of the echo chamber. So I'm not sure about you guys, but I go to many different events, many different conferences, and what I tend to find it is a lot of the same people in the room. And so I actually love seeing university students, high school students here. I think that it's such an opportunity for us to talk a little bit about the work we're doing, but I'm also really interested in your questions because they're not the questions that we normally get. One of my very good friends told me recently, I guess it wasn't recent, it was just after New Year's, because I said, what's your New Year's resolution? And she said, actually, my New Year's resolution is to talk to people who have different views than me. And I thought that was such a strange New Year's resolution, but it's actually quite brilliant. So within this sector, I think we all tend to be fairly aligned on our values, our approaches. It is a fairly siloed sector because organizations are often not resource strapped, but maybe don't have tons of resources to do our work. And so we're not always in a position to do partnerships the way we've wanted to. But when we have, I think it really demonstrates the kind of impact that happens when you do break out of those silos. As an example, we partner with Bain & Company, which is a consultancy firm. And one of the things that they bring to the table is providing mentorship across the globe to young women. And it is a way for us to really deepen the impact of our program, and then it's also an excellent employee engagement opportunity for them because they are able to say to their staff, we're happy to pay you to work with these young women and help develop this next generation of female leaders. Those are the types of partnerships that Girls 20 does quite often, and I find that what it allows us to do is, for the size of our organization, it really, really deepens our impact. So it's something that I would continue to say to break out of that echo chamber and think about what type of partnerships you can have, what you can bring to the table, and what they can bring to the table.
And I think from the perspective of Rumi, as an organization that delivers online learning resources around the world, partnerships are key for us. We are technology experts, but our partners are the content experts. They're the ones that are delivering access to digital learning resources around the world, and they're the ones that are implementing it locally for us. So partnerships really is inherent to our business model as an organization. And I think for us, there's a few things that really are key for how partnerships help us in doing what we do. And I think the first one is they help us to innovate and to iterate as well. And I'll give you an example of that. So we've got a product, our Rumi tablet. And this tablet here is one of the ways in which we deliver access to digital learning resources online and offline around the world. But receiving consistent feedback on our products and our solutions from our partner is really key for us because it helps us create the best possible product out there for any learner around the world. And one of the things we were hearing consistently was that it was great when people were able to interact with the tablet itself, whether online or offline. But if you take an example of a Syrian refugee in a refugee camp in Jordan, if they're going to that learning center, they're interacting with our tablet and learning, but if they're going back home or they're leaving that camp, that learning stops. So as a result of that, we created the Rumi app to be able to allow people to learn on any Android-based device, whether that's a tablet or a smartphone, anywhere around the world. And another example of that would be a partnership we have in Afghanistan with a telecom company called Roshan. So in January, our Rumi app, which is created from that feedback, is now going to be rolling out across the country in a country that has literacy rates, some of the lowest in the world, around 30%, with female literacy rates at around 17.5%. So that app is now going to provide women and girls the opportunity to be able to learn where if they can't access a school, whether that's for cultural, societal norms or other reasons, they will have the ability or the possibility to learn in their own homes on their own time.
Those are all great ideas, and I'm going to turn back now where I think we are meant to have questions from the audience and from the audiences in the 5 other cities that are also tuning in. Okay, so this is a good one. I guess it's only, let's see. Let's see, I'm not going to read. I'm like, I think that one only applies to not the queen part, but the woman of color part only applies to me. Are we seeing a rise of more female leaders? Okay. You know what? I'll broaden the question. What are some difficulties that you have faced as women, and in some cases as outsiders, since you came to this work in interesting paths, in advocating for the work that you do?
Well, I think first and foremost, I'm an extremely privileged person. I grew up in a suburban house in Vancouver, and I am white, and I have just, after all the travel I've done around the world, my whole thinking is, how am I going to spend my privilege, honestly? How am I going to spend my privilege, be it in my workspace, in my personal space? And that's really the approach I've taken. And I think when it comes to what the challenges I've faced as a woman, they're kind of everybody else's in many ways too. Imposter syndrome, Julie spoke a little bit about it. I'm the CEO of an organization. I still never tell people that. I tell them I work for an organization called Girls 20. And they say, well, what do you do there? And I literally go, I'm the CEO. I feel like it's a weird thing to say out loud, and I know I should get over that, but at the same time, I also feel a change from them as soon as I say it that I try to avoid, because usually I just want to have a really authentic conversation, and I notice they immediately kind of straighten up and they start talking to me a little bit differently. So I would say that's one thing. I think also in general, just being a woman in this sector, I mean, I've been a proud feminist since I was about 10 years old, and I have spent a lot of time explaining what feminism means to me, and having really hard conversations around it. And so, again, whether it's been professional or personal, I think what's been challenging for me has always been trying to explain why I believe feminism will actually save the world. And I have a shirt that says feminist. My partner is from Northern Ontario, like very Northern Ontario. And whenever we're up there, he's like, please don't wear the shirt. But I wear it all the time because it's actually also when I have the best conversations around what feminism means, around what it means for men, around what it means for women. And so, while I've had challenges, some of them put upon myself the imposter syndrome, some of them just trying to get people to take the work that I do very seriously. I have found that generally, partially because I'm very privileged, partially because I'm super passionate about my work, I haven't faced too much in the sense of, challenges in getting in there and having people listen, kind of whether they want to be listening or not sometimes.
We're going to get you a t-shirt that says CEO, and we're going to get your partner a t-shirt that says feminist.
Oh, he has one.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I got him one. He loves it.
I would echo everything you've said, Heather. I guess the only experience that we may have had differently is actually in politics. It's not an easy place to be a young woman, but I've been lucky to have remarkable colleagues who have empowered me and supported me. But there's still a lot to be done in Ottawa, and I'm sure in every parliament across the world and in every province here. And I think just to bring it back to our conversation on why, or how we can address gender equality and why it's so important, what Heather and I've just raised speaks to precisely what we need to do. We still have entrenched gender norms and values that disproportionately affect women negatively and gender diverse people. So, going back to the work that I'm doing right now as part of the Women Deliver mobilization, we have an opportunity this year. Canada will be hosting the largest conference in the world on gender equality in the world in June 2019 in Vancouver. The world's going to be paying attention to us. We have an opportunity to have those difficult conversations, to challenge decision makers across sectors at all levels to make and take concrete actions to change those entrenched kind of norms, thank you. So I would encourage you all to do the same, whether that is with friends, with professors, with colleagues. It's a conversation that still has a long way to go.
Yeah, those are all great points. I'll add in, from the perspective of a woman of color, you know, when I was starting the Malala Fund, I was 22, I would have people literally look at me in a meeting and say, "Sweetheart, how old are you?" And it was awful, and it was a nonprofit sector, which is more traditional than the startup sector. Startup sector, where I am now, young people are worshipped, preferably white males who dropped out of Harvard and are starting, you know, a dating app. Not so much. So the youth thing was not a challenge. The woman of color thing was a huge challenge. The woman of color who had previously been in the development sector was a challenge, because if you're from the development sector, then you are not welcome in finance and technology and, you know. And I think for a while when I started investing, I was trying to imitate the men, and it didn't work, and it was exhausting. And eventually, I think I just started to lean into the fact that I was a woman and a person of color and someone who came at this with a specific angle. And it, A, became a lot more enjoyable. B, it helped make the things I participated in a lot more values aligned. So I would walk into a room where I was deciding whether or not to invest in an entrepreneur, and let's say it was a startup that had a lot of options. Sometimes when you have a very hot idea, you can have a lot of options, and at that point, I'm almost competing to put my capital in, and I would turn to them and say, "Oh, so you feel like you have enough investors? Well, how many of them are women? How many of them are people of color? How many of them care about your values? How many of them are gonna, you know, when it's time to choose between the bottom line and staying true to your values, will remind you of why you started this and what you stand for?" And I'm sure I lost some deals, but I also gained some as a result of making that very clear, and I think they ended up being the ones that, at the end of the day, I want to advocate for and spend my finite time supporting. So yeah, it's exhausting to not be who you are. Might as well lean into it. All right, let's see. What kind of initiatives can students start in order to advocate and support issues surrounding gender equality? And I'll ask you to start, Matt, since, yeah.
Thank you kindly. For students, I think the one thing that is really important is in everything that you do, see it through a gender lens. And that really will help inform the decisions you make, whether that's in your personal life, your professional life, whether that's choosing how you're gonna move forward in university or college or whatever you decide to do with your life, but make sure you incorporate that into everything that you're doing. And from a very simple perspective, you know, get engaged with organizations that are aligned with your values. So if you're truly passionate about gender equality and gender inclusion, then seek out those organizations. There's, you know, one right here that I know of that, you know, are working in that space, and really show them, you know, what you have to offer and what you can bring to the table so that you can move forward in your career with that lens.
Yeah, can I add on to that? Yeah, I absolutely echo that as well. And I think people reach out to me often and are like, "I want to get involved, I want to get involved, I want to get involved." And I'm like, "Listen, I get 100 emails a day. How do you want to get involved? Tell me what you want to do. You know, you see what my organization's up to. What do you want to do with us?" And one of the things we're developing is sort of an online magazine that's entirely curated by young women, because they wrote and said, I want to write, and I want to tell my story, and I think my story is really interesting. And I'm like, your story is really interesting. So absolutely, we've just created that simply because we heard from people. So I think, to Matt's point, when you do reach out and when you are saying, this is what I can bring to the table, most organizations are super responsive, especially if they're good organizations and they want to be you know, youth-driven. They will respond to what you want to do and how you want to get engaged.
There's not much more to add, but yeah, I would echo everything that's been said. I think even if you aren't necessarily, you know, in a school where there are clubs or organizations, you can take it on yourself as well. I remember, you know, putting on feminist book clubs in high school. And so that's something that, you know, is an easy way, but it again just advances that really important conversation that we need to be having as a whole of society.
Sorry, I want to say one more thing. I don't want to be that person that talks the most, though.
This is your stage.
To that point, I also think I spoke a little bit earlier about talking to people who have different views from you. I also want to tell you to find your community. And I think that particularly when you're in high school and when you're moving into university and throughout university, that can be a bit tricky. Online social media platforms can also be tricky, but equally I think when you find a community that works for you and you are able to work well with them, the type of output you'll have is incredible. And I think, you know, if I'm sitting down with someone who's a potential funder to the organization, I talk a lot about the advocacy work we do and how effective I think it is. But if I'm actually just talking to young women, what I tell them is once you're part of the Girls 20 community, you find your best friends. And that kind of impact for young women in particular, I think allows them to move into whatever career or personal path that they're going through in a really effective and empowered way. So just want to add that.
I love that. So to sum up, lots of great ideas. Be intentional about the people you surround yourselves with. Don't just hang around with people because it's convenient if they are not lifting you up. I agree with that. I think it really determines who you become. Show up for organizations and causes that you care about and be specific, right? When you write to someone, don't say, I want to change the world, don't know where to start. Say, you know, hey, I'm a really great photographer and I can commit 6 hours a week for the next 6 months. Do you have any projects where I can come and document your work so that you can put it online and use it to advance your cause? And then also keep in mind, you know, these experiences will be fulfilling, but it is work. And so you need to commit, you need to continue to show up when it gets hard and is sometimes boring and frustrating, because that's the nature of the work. And I think sometimes when we're volunteering, we want it to be about us, but it's really about bringing the change and about the people that we're trying to support. All right, let's see one more. Oh.
Do we have, in Edmonton, do we have any questions from the floor? If we don't, we'll just continue with Slido. Back to you.
And if you, oh yes, we have one right there. Do we have a microphone or shall we ask the gentleman to project? Right there?
There are two microphones, one in the back of the room over here and one just over there. If you could move to the microphone so everyone can hear you. Shouting won't work, unfortunately. Yeah, if you could just migrate over to the microphone, come up the stairs and run your way down. My goodness. Talk about agile and nimble. Over to you.
I was just going to ask, were all of you straight A students? What do you think does your GPA reflect? Like, what if you have an F at school, but you have these big ideas? Does that reflect how much you can affect the world?
Yeah, I'll take that first. So my first go-around at university, I was definitely not a straight A student. My first go-around at university, the first year I kind of went there and did pretty poorly. I was like, all right, well, I'll go back for a second shot, and then I dropped out completely. And the reason that I did that, because I wasn't passionate about anything. And then when I worked a few jobs, I traveled a little bit, telemarketing, that was a super fun one. I decided maybe it's time to go back to university. And when I went back there, that's when I got super engaged. But to be honest with you, I was never the student that was a straight A, top of my class, right? But I was someone that knew that I was passionate about doing something, and once I found that, I really excelled. And it's really about, it's not about the marks or the numbers or what degree you have, if you have an MBA or a PhD or what have you. It's truly about who you are, how you carry yourself as an individual, and staying true to the impact that you want to have wherever that is.
Yeah, same. I was a terrible student, actually. I think if you looked at my grades, you would say, oh, you really enjoy these types of courses, and you really didn't enjoy these types of courses. I think that one of the best things about finishing university and getting out into the world is realizing that people who are pragmatic and can actually get a lot of work done are the ones who tend to be quite valued, and nobody's ever going to ask you your GPA, promise.
I was a straight A student. But I will say, so I pursued a master's degree, and not that I regret it, but I would say that I actually wish I had used those years to develop other skills, like skills that are developed traveling. Not that I haven't traveled, but more skills that you just can't develop necessarily in a classroom. And so it's not just about your grades, and it's not just about what school you went to or how many degrees you have. It is at the end of the day about whether or not you're passionate and effective at the work that you want to do.
So that's a great question. So look, I have massive issues with the education system. I hated school. I was super bored and restless. My teachers were mean, mostly. But the night before the test, I stayed up, I drank Red Bull, and I aced those tests. And if I hadn't, I wouldn't be here, because I wasn't born in North America. I was born in a middle-class family in Pakistan. I got out because I had great stories and essays and experience, but the reason people read those essays was because in those first lines there were the A's and the SAT score was good. And I wouldn't be here, I wouldn't belong to this club if I hadn't done that. And so I think it also depends, you know, getting straight A's and doing well in school can be one ticket out if you are not born in a community or in a social class where you will have access. So don't discount it if you can. And there's, by the way, I always did the easy stuff, right? Like at Stanford, I did the international relations degree. I didn't do the, you know, computer science and mathematics, like double major, right? So to me, for how I'm inclined, that was an easy degree for me. So I was able to graduate, you know, with distinction, doing far less work than a lot of my classmates. Now, that's not the approach I'm advocating. It's something I've had to undo, right? Because in the real world, it's not like school. It's a lot harder, and you have to be entrepreneurial and practical, and you have to be willing to fail. But the world is set up in such a way where if you can get good grades, it's one way to get out. And if that's not, and there's ways to navigate the system, knowing that, right? To take the classes that allow you to access the world. And if you can't do it that way, think about the other ways in which you do that. Like what it will be your ticket into the conversations that you want to be a part of, into the influence that you want to have. Maybe it's sports, maybe it's musical talent, but try to find one thing that will allow you to excel at something. Yeah.
Shiza, we have time for one more question from the floor in Edmonton and one Slido question.
So we'll take your question then.
Hi, my name is Megan. I'm a novice registered nurse, and one of the challenges I found, I was super active in university, involved in nonprofits across Canada, and now that I've graduated and I've been in the workforce about 1.5 years now, and I find like the biggest challenge I found is finding that connection and losing that connection, I guess, kind of with a lot of those organizations or the opportunities that you're provided to as students. And I'm wondering, and I'm trying to work towards this, is how can we, I guess, narrow that gap? And because I think we have a lot to offer, you know, novice professionals in any profession, and yeah, I'm interested to hear kind of what your perspective is on that and where we can, I guess, narrow that gap. And yeah.
Also, the two ladies who sat down, who are standing, I really want to hear your questions. If you go back up there, we'll try and sneak it in as like the last question. I feel bad because they were standing there. Okay, answer.
Should I answer? Okay. So actually, the Canadian Nurses Association does a lot around gender equality initiatives and international development. So I think every professional association actually has a number of initiatives that you could reach out to and see what's available, or even if they're online groups, right? Being active that way. And then the other piece I'd say is show up. There's events left, right, and center. It can be really daunting to show up to an event alone. But if it's a cause and a topic that is important to you, you will likely find similarly minded people, and you won't feel alone, and you will create those connections, and you may actually find out that there is a group, you know, that you can be part of and you can be involved with. The other piece I'd say, and Heather mentioned this, is social media. Social media is such an incredible tool for advocacy, and as an individual, if you have a connection to internet and you have a social media account, there's so much that you can do with that. You know, EWB earlier, who's a mobilizer for the mobilization, thank you, has a great campaign, and you need to, all you need is access to internet, and you know, you're sending letters to the Prime Minister, you're tweeting out to XYZ company. So there's actually a lot, I think, that you can do through social media as well.
Also, don't discount how interesting your story and your perspective is. So there was just the tragic shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and after that, the shooter was treated by a nurse, and she's become just this incredible role model, because she wrote about her experience treating this man, and she said, I don't think he knew I was Jewish. And as she started to share her story, people got to know the rest of her and her voice and her perspective, and what is it like to treat someone who would have shot you if he knew you were Jewish, and now you're saving his life. And I've been captivated by her. And so, you know, don't discount how interesting the things that you experience, or your story, or your voice, or your perspectives are to the rest of us who don't have access to that world and to that life. All right, we'll do one last question, and that'll be our wrap-up question.
So I was thinking, what do you think that those that do not conform to gender binary get their messages out there when most don't take them seriously?
Yeah, that's a great question. Even for our organization, we've really had to work at changing the language as, you know, people who identify as women when we are doing our applications. And to be very frank, it actually came up against a lot of pushback, and it spoke earlier about being very privileged. It was a quick lesson for me on how important it is that we use that language, because the pushback indicates, in my mind, we're probably doing something correctly, and how we as an organization need to be thinking in different ways. And so for us, the only way to do that is to actually work with the community themselves. And so we've started to do some outreach within the trans community on how we could better our programs, and we're still having those conversations, but those are the types of things that I think are entirely necessary, and often, I do want to say, and often are not something that, you know, if you haven't worked in it, you have the right ideas around it. So for us, it's really about consultations and really making sure we're consulting with the right groups.
I just read an incredible book called This Is How It's Always Been, and it's the story of a family with a trans child, and it entirely opened my eyes and shifted my perspective. So again, you know, I think hearing your stories, hearing your experiences, for those of us who don't have that experience, who don't have that insight, is still valuable. And with that, any final thoughts, ideas, suggestions as we close this panel?
Yeah, I would just say it's important to know the difference between equality and equity. So equality is obviously ensuring that everyone is treated fairly, and that is of the utmost importance, and equally. But also, equity is important as we apply it with a gender equality lens, in that we need to ensure that we're giving girls and women the tools that are necessary in order to succeed and to provide that level playing field, and to realize that, you know, those tools aren't a one-size-fits-all type of solution, and that you have to be flexible in the way that you deliver programs to ensure you're being as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, and just to echo that, I think the only way you can do that is through consultations. I just mentioned it now, but to give you a very practical example, when we do our global summit in advance of the G20, we usually take what the G20 leaders will be focused on and develop our recommendations around that. We did consultations with young women around the world, and one key thing kept coming out, and it really does relate to the SDGs as well, was gender-based violence, and how every single girl around the world and young woman who did respond to our survey brought it up, saying we need to make sure that above and beyond everything we read into these recommendations, we need to discuss gender-based violence. And it kind of blew me away in the sense that how ubiquitous it was, and as deeply saddening as that is, it was also an opportunity for us to say absolutely, and so we ended up including an entire theme around it when it was never planned. So I think that in order to do some of that work, we need to make sure that we're consulting with those and really having them drive that agenda.
So I would say that, and we've kind of seen this throughout the sessions this morning, but the world and Canada requires bold action if we are to achieve the SDGs, and particularly if we are to make gender equality a reality. And I'll make my final pitch here, but the Women Deliver conference that will be held in June in Vancouver does really present an opportunity for all of us to come together and push for that bold commitment. What we're trying to do is work together across sectors, across Canada, so that decision makers in all sectors and at all levels can feel that pressure and know that we are expecting that they will make concrete changes. So if you're interested and have any questions, come see me, but would encourage you all to look at the Women Deliver mobilization.
Thank you so much. Please join me in celebrating our panelists.
Thank you very much. And also a good hand of applause for Shiza, and the very motivational speech that she shared with us. Thank you. Thank you so much. A couple of quick announcements. We're going to break for lunch, and we're going to be starting up again at 2 in this room. A note about lunch before you go. Don't leave for lunch because we have one task before we do this. Make sure that you have your name tags for lunch. There's no food in the theater, so you can't bring it back. It's all to be outside or the Dinwiddie lounge. What we're going to do now is, because we want to ensure that we don't forget that we were here in Together 2018, all students, all participants, please join us on stage. We have a photographer who's going to take a picture of all of us. Join us now, then we'll break for lunch. Come on down. All right, don't be shy. The faster we move to the stage, the faster we're going to go to lunch. The pictures will be taken quickly, so... Where are the stage guys? Where are the stage guys? Where are the stage guys? It won't work if these are on.
Do you want these to be...
Yeah, just move them out if you would. All right. Join the stage and just back up towards the screen. Back up towards the screen because we're going to be shooting from the top. All right, so you can back up just a little bit. Move back as much as you can, but because we will see you. All right, join us on stage. You can stand here. Photographer, would this work if they stay here?
John, stand in the front. No.
Good. Could you come up on the stage? Would that be okay?
Well, it's hard to do.
Is it on the steps?
Yeah.
It's
hard to do.
Okay, just stay there then. All right, please join us. Don't be shy. All right. Thank you so much for moving so fast. Come on in, make your... Oh, yes, the signs are good. All right. Those of you who are there...